Assalamualaikum and good day everyone. Quick check. Have you found your speaking buddy? I hope you have, and I pray that the process you're going through right now to speak and practice speaking is going smoothly, inshallah. Ready for tip number 2? Tip number 2 involves reading. Let's be honest, reading is a very important process that anybody goes through when you want to learn something new and you want to become better at something. For those of you who are just starting to become confident and familiar with the English language, I would recommend that you use children's book. There's really no point in you buying that thick novel where after the first page you realize that there are too many words you don't understand and you don't know what the book is trying to tell you, and you end up putting it aside, and then there goes that effort all over again. So use children's book. Why? The words are simple and the words are always repeated. The phrases are repeated to help you get that familiarity and understand how the words are used, how the phrases are used. Start with children's book. No harm, regardless of your age. As Muslims, we learn to recite the Quran, yes? Even if we learn to recite the Quran at a later age, we typically would still have to start with the Muqaddam before we can jump back into the Quran. So start with baby steps. For English, start with children's book. I'm going to share with you my personal favorite, Peter and Jane series. I grew up reading this book. At school, as in kindergarten, and at home, this was the book that my siblings and I read before we went on to reading other books. Now this is 2A. I picked this book because it was just jutting out, and this is the book that I'm reading with my daughter right now. One of the reasons why I love the Peter and Jane series is because, first things first, the characters are simple. Simple, and they start with minimal number of characters before they move on to introduce other characters. So the words are simple, the characters are very, very easy, the words are repeated, the phrases are repeated again and again and again, so that whoever's reading it gets familiar with how to use the words, how to use the phrases. Let's go through some examples, all right, of how things are repeated. Okay, let's look at this page. Peter is here, Jane is here, all right? Now, these two sentences have already been repeated many times in books 1A and 1B. So by the time you get to book 2A, you already understand that when you're referring to one person, you use is, and then you tell what that person is doing or where that person is. But usage wise, you already know that's how you use is, right? And there's another one here, Pat is here, because if you read the series, you know that Pat is the dog, and we're referring to one dog, which is just Pat. So is again here, it's repeated. Simple sentences, and it is repeated. Let's look at another example. Okay, the word like. They like. So automatically, again, this has been repeated before in books 1A and 1B. You would eventually understand and become familiar with the fact that when you're talking about many people, you use like without the S. But Pat likes, and then again it's repeated, Pat likes. So you know that when it's referring to one thing or one person, like, it has an S, likes. Pat likes. Imagine that you've been doing this since book 1A, and by the time you get to book 2A, you would already understand that, okay, this is when I use like, this is when I use likes, this is when I use is, this is when I use are. I'm just going to give you one more example. Okay, using once with an S. Now, the dog wants. The dog is referring to one dog, therefore once with an S. He wants, because he is also referring to one dog. He wants with an S. If you read this again and again, you will then understand when to use want and when to use once. Do this without having to go through the process of going for grammar classes where things can become a little bit complicated because it's so ruly, it's so technical, like I've said before. We're looking at easy ways to learn the language so that you become confident. So use a children's book. It can be any book. Like I said, this is just my personal favorite because I grew up with it. It worked for me, and it seems to be working for my daughter as well. Of course, she makes mistakes. She's 3. But generally, her usage is I would say 70% correct. And that's good enough for me at 3 years old because she's still learning. So use children's book because it's easy. Now, if you're a parent, I would recommend that you do this with your children, especially if you have little kids. Read with your children. You can read it to them, they can read it to you. It's also bonding time with them. If you are an adult, you can read it on your own, or if you have your speaking buddy with you, you can read it with your speaking buddy. I have another recommendation when it comes to reading. You have to read it out loud. If you are reading it with your children, of course you'll have to read it out loud because they will be listening to you. But if you're doing this on your own, read to yourself out loud. Here's why. We all know how to recite the Quran, yes? In the process of us learning to recite the Quran, do we read it out loud or do we read it in our heart? Even when we are reading on our own, after prayers, in the middle of the night, do we typically read it in our heart or do we read it out loud? We recite out loud. There's a reason why. When we recite out loud to someone else, that person can hear us and help correct us. When we are reading it to ourselves, we are telling ourselves, this is how it's recited, this is how it's read, this is how it is said. And more often than not, even when we are reading it on our own, but because we're reading it out loud, we can hear our mistakes compared to when we are just reading it in our heart, because we can't hear ourselves. The key here is to read and read it out loud, whether you're reading it with someone, to someone, or even on your own. You have to read it out loud. Tip number 2 is to read. Start with a children's book. It can be anything, but this is by far the series I find most effective. But it could be it can be any children's book. Read on your own, with your speaking buddy, or with your children, and you need to read it out loud. Reading will help you become familiar with usage, sentence structure, so that when you speak, your mind already has those structure, already has those phrases in your mind, in your head, and it's much easier for you to articulate, easier for you to actually say it. Happy trying. I hope this works for you. The next time I see you, I will share simple mistakes that I've heard people say, and we will try to correct them along the way. Till then, this is the little girl with a million words, signing off.